and the reports of the medical faculty in Paris for advice on how to avert the impending disaster. The philosophers advised that the corrupted air should be purified with fire. This would drive away the infected cloud that caused the plague. So when the plague was in reach of the Pope's palace, de Chiliac ordered huge fires to be built within the papal grounds. Then the doctor arranged for the Pope to sit between them. The Pope's fires burned day and night for 4 months, while the plague raged through Avignon. No rat or flea could penetrate the intense heat. The Pope sat, protected, in splendid isolation, all through the heat of the summer. Meanwhile, in the city of Avignon, thousands continued to die.
But the Spaniard, his horse and his pig would never have been so successful in the conquest of the New World without a hidden passenger. It is when the old and new worlds touch that the American Indian meets his worst enemy. A very black dose for the continent. A Spanish missionary reports.
An epidemic broke out, a sickness of pustules. Large bumps spread on people. Some were entirely covered, on the face, the head, the chest. They lay in their dwellings and sleeping places, no longer able to move or stir. The pustules caused great desolation. Very many people died of them, and many starved to death. No one took care of others any longer.
Deadly diseases contaminate the entire continent.
For the natives,
writes a chronicler,
they are near all dead of the smallpox, so the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess.
To this day, scientists are still working to identify these diseases, to trace their paths, and count the dead.
Smallpox was accidentally introduced to the Americas in the 16th century. The smallpox virus is very hardy. In blankets that are used by smallpox victims, the scabs can live for weeks carrying the virus. And smallpox can also pass from host to host on board a transatlantic vessel until it reaches the Americas. And of course, once smallpox reached the Americas, it was introduced to millions of new hosts, human hosts, who had no acquired immunities to these diseases. And so smallpox, together with measles and influenza, had a devastating impact on Native American populations. No one knows exactly what the mortality was. Conservative estimates are about 50%. It was probably closer to 90% or even higher.
Through trade between native peoples, diseases spread throughout the whole continent. Many natives die of foreign diseases without ever seeing a European. Microbes move faster than the conquistadors who brought them. Some 50 years after Columbus discovered the Americas, conquistadors and explorers find neither towns nor people. No one stands in their way. Most of the people are dead, and nature reclaims the land.
A quarantine is when people have been exposed to a disease, perhaps.
They'll generally put a sign on your house if you have a communicable disease. You're basically away from certain things.
Like extreme seclusion.
Kind of locked in your house, basically.
Quarantine is an effective public health tool, and it's especially important when we don't have other tools to combat a certain disease. Quarantine is used for separating people who are not yet ill, but who have been exposed to an infectious disease from others who have not yet been exposed. When someone's been exposed to an important, serious, contagious disease, there are several options.
For instance, if you were on a plane or in a building that had a report of a contagious disease, you could be delayed a few hours, examined by a medical doctor, and then allowed to leave after providing your contact information. You could be quarantined for a short time in a facility where you can be given a vaccine or preventative treatment, or be kept for the entire incubation period of the disease, monitored and cared for. You also could be asked to stay at home, limiting your contact with others. In rare instances, a large-scale quarantine could involve home curfews, the cancellation of public gatherings, and the closure of mass transit.
In the modern era, we place much more emphasis on providing support and medical care for those in quarantine, making sure they get what they need so that they can stay in quarantine, and making sure they get the medical care that they need if they become ill.
If a person starts to exhibit symptoms of a serious contagious disease, they may be isolated.
Quarantine can usually be done in the home, whereas isolation is usually done in the hospital where the ill person can receive medical care.
Neither a quarantine nor isolation may ever happen to us, but it's something we should all be prepared for.
We need to talk about quarantine because we may need to use it given the new types of infectious disease threats that we have in the modern society. We also need to talk about quarantine because the more people understand about it, the better able they are to cooperate with it and the more effective it will be. It may not be easy to be in quarantine, but it's very important to help protect the health of you, your family, and your community.
To access the most accurate and relevant health information that affects you, your family, and your community, please visit www.cdc.gov.
The Ebola patient Thomas Eric Duncan has been in isolation at the hospital since Sunday. Meanwhile, his family is under a quarantine order. His son's mother, Louise, his own child, and his two nephews all in one apartment. They've been told some specific things. They can't even go down the stairs, for example. My colleague Anderson Cooper spoke exclusively with Louise earlier this week.
So what did they tell you then that you needed to do?
To stay home. I needed to stay home and monitor be taking my temperature. They were going to be monitoring all of us. My son should stay home, my nephews, every one of us should stay home for 21 days. And we should not come outside. If we have to come outside, right on the porch, but not get down the stairs.
What did you think when you heard that?
Scary. I'm scary.
And have you gone outside at all?
No, I'm inside, and they did not bring food yet. They came late here last night with paperwork for us to sign. That if we step outside, then they're going to take us. They're going to take us to court. They don't have committed a crime, but up to this time, they have not brought us any food. Any food.
That was Thursday morning, and since then she has been delivered some food. But for most people, this is totally unfamiliar territory, but not for Dr. Howard Markel. He joins me now. He's a professor of pediatrics and communicable diseases at the University of Michigan, a medical historian and author of the book Quarantine. Thanks for being back on the program, Doc.
Thank you, Sanjay.
You know, when they hear this scenario that I just described, I think it's pretty shocking for a lot of people. But health officials pretty much anywhere in the United States do have this power, right? Well, what is the limit of the power?
Well, the powers are actually quite strong. More than 100 years ago, the Commissioner of Health of New York City was testifying before Congress, and they asked, what are the limits of your powers? And he said, well, Senator, I could make City Hall a quarantine hospital tomorrow if I wanted to. So if indeed the health authorities feel that you're a threat, that you're not cooperating, and that you might infect others, particularly for a very serious disease like Ebola, their powers are extremely strong.
As I understand it, and part of this is from reading your books, frankly, the practice of quarantine, I mean, even the word itself goes back to 14th century Venice. It wasn't Ebola, obviously, they were trying to stop at that time, but it was the Black Plague. Is that right?
Yes, it was bubonic plague, and Venice was one of the major ports of the world at that time, and plague was traveling, just as Ebola is today, and they ordered a quarantinaria, or 40 giorno, which means 40 days. That's where the word quarantine comes from. But ever since that 1375 edict of quarantine, we've been fine-tuning and changing the meaning of the word.
Did it work? I mean, would you say quarantines work? Is there a way to give a context? How well do they work?
Well, this is an eternal question in public health. You know, when it was done back then, and even till, you know, maybe 100 years ago, it was often relied upon as a means of last resort because we didn't have antibiotics or antivirals or vaccines. Today, it's very rarely done, but only for diseases that are very easily transmitted, such as influenza, if it were a deadly form of influenza, because that could be transmitted while you're in close contact with someone if they cough or sneeze at you. And the other one is for a disease that is so novel and so deadly that we don't want to take chances. And so I think Ebola is falling in that latter category. But people have been arguing whether it works or not ever since quarantine was first proposed in the 14th century.
You know, I think a lot of people, when they hear quarantine, they hear these stories, they think about Typhoid Mary. That's a story a lot of people are familiar with. She was a carrier of the disease typhoid, and that means she wasn't sick herself, but she could give it to others. And unfortunately, she was a cook, so she made a lot of people sick. And the city locked her up. For how long was she locked up?
Oh, well, she was locked up twice. Once they let her out after about 4 or 5 years, and then she went back to cooking. And you do carriers of typhoid, it's salmonella, carry it in their gallbladder, and it does shed on their hands when they cook, so she got other people sick. And then she spent another decade or more on North Brother Island, which is in the East River of New York City. And I've been there. It's even though you're right near a city, it's about as desolate and lonely a place as you can imagine.
Dr. Howard Markel, it's always good to see you, and I see Ann Arbor, Michigan behind you. According to Forbes magazine, the most educated city in America. I love that we have that in common, sir. Thanks.